Hi guys, welcome to day 3 of math lesson 14.4, comparing fractions. So today we're going to be comparing unlike fractions with the same numerator. So let's take a look at what we did last time. So remember last time we were looking at like fractions, which means we were looking at fractions that had the same denominator. Remember this, guys? So today we're going to be looking at unlike fractions that have the same numerator. And remember, the numerator is the number on top. So our helper friend is telling us the fractions have the same numerator. So compare the denominators. So we're going to be looking at these two fractions that we see with these bar models. And we're going to see if we can tell just by looking at them which one is greater or bigger, 3/5 or 3/6. That's hard to say, guys. So we can tell that if we only have 5 pieces and 3 of them are shaded, that's going to be bigger than if we have 6 pieces and only 3 of them are shaded. So even though 3 of each one are shaded, we know that 3 out of 5 would be bigger than 3 out of 6 because as we split something into more pieces, the pieces get smaller, right guys? Does that make sense? So we can tell that 3/5 is greater than 3/6. And it says the greater fraction is the one with the smaller denominator. So that's a little tricky. So the way we want to think about it is that as the denominator gets bigger, the pieces get smaller. So if we have the same number of pieces, like in this case with the numerators being the same, then if the denominator gets bigger, the pieces get smaller. So yeah. Okay, down here, let's look at our next part. It says, which fraction is less, 2/10 or 2/7? So it's really asking us 2 pieces out of a total of 10 or 2 pieces out of only 7. So we can tell that with 10 pieces, the pieces got a lot smaller, right guys? So the bigger that denominator gets, the smaller those pieces get. So 2 out of 10 is, or 2 out of 10 I should say, is less than 2 out of 7. So 2/10 is less than 2/7. The smaller fraction is the one with the greater denominator. Fractions with different denominators are unlike fractions. So we learned last time that like fractions were fractions with the same denominator. So the ones we are looking at right now are unlike fractions. They have different denominators. Okay, let's do our bottom part real quick. And our first problem, number 10, says, which is less, 3/8 or 3/5? So we can tell that 3 out of 8 would be less than 3 out of 5 because as we split that into more pieces, the pieces get smaller, right guys? So we can tell that those 2 bars are exactly the same size to start with, but one of them's cut into 8 pieces and one of them's only cut into 5 pieces. So we definitely know that 3 out of 8 is less than 3 out of 5. All right, number 11, which is greater this time, 1/3 or 1/7? So we can see from the bar model that 1 out of 3 is much bigger than 1 out of 7, right? Because when we split it into more pieces, then the pieces get smaller. So 1/3 is greater than 1/7. Let's move on. Okay, so it looks like now we're going to be comparing unlike fractions that have different numerators and different denominators. So things are going to get a little bit tricky, but that's okay because we have a strategy that we can use that we'll talk about in just a minute. So let's read our first problem here. It says pi A and pi B are vegetarian pies of the same size. So remember, we can only compare fractions if they are starting from a whole thing that's exactly the same size. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So these two pies are the same size. Mrs. Jones cut 3/4 of pi A, there's pi A, for Sue. So that's 1, 2, 3 out of a total of 4. And then she cut 7/8 of pi B for Tim. So pi B started out the same size as pi A, however, it got cut into more pieces, and she gave 7 out of the 8 to Tim. So we can tell by looking at this that 7/8 is more than 3/4, right? So that's one way we can compare fractions that are unlike fractions, is by using a picture like this. However, that would take us quite a while, right, guys, if we were to draw a picture for every single time we had to compare two fractions that have different numerators and different denominators. So that is one strategy that can help us to see what we're comparing. But a really easy way that we can begin to understand how to compare unlike fractions is we can use multiplication. And when we use multiplication, all we have to do is rewrite them as like fractions. So basically, we're going to take the two unlike fractions and we're going to turn them into like fractions so that they're easier to compare. And remember, like fractions are fractions that have the same denominator. So our goal when we see unlike fractions with different numerators and different denominators is we want to get them to where they have the same denominator. And if you might remember that one thing we can do to change the denominator is we can multiply it by something. But also remember, if we multiply the bottom, which is the denominator, we also have to multiply the top by that same number. So let's look at the steps they're telling us. It says first, find an equivalent fraction of 3/4. Remember, we learned all about equivalent fractions. Okay, so find an equivalent fraction of 3/4 that has the same denominator as 7/8. So when we look at 3/4, we can tell by looking at that all we would have to do to that 4 is multiply it by 2, right, guys? Because we know that 4 times 2 is 8. So we want to get it to have the same denominator as this 7/8 so that we can compare them easily. So, of course, if we multiply the denominator, we've got to multiply that numerator too. So we know 3 times 2 is 6, which means that 6/8 is equivalent to or equal to 3/4. So now we've found an equivalent fraction of 3/4 that has the same denominator as 7/8. So now they are much easier to compare, right, guys? It says now the fractions 6/8 and 7/8 have a common denominator. So a common denominator just means now they have the same denominator, so they're so much easier to compare now, even though this is the same as this. Notice, guys, that 3/4, it's the same as 6/8, which is what we just did over here, and we can see that right here. And then it's just so much easier to compare because we know that 6 out of 8 is definitely less than 7 out of 8, right? So Tim got the larger piece and Sue got the smaller piece. Okay, let's do a few more. Okay, it says find an equivalent fraction then compare. So number 12 is which is greater, 1/2 or 4/10? Now that would be just, we wouldn't be able to do that just off the top of our head, right guys? To try and think of 1 out of 2 or 4 out of 10, right? So the first thing we want to do is find an equivalent fraction of 1/2 that has the same denominator as 4/10. That way we will easily be able to tell which one is greater or bigger. So we want to start by asking ourselves, what would we have to multiply by that 2 to make it a 10? And since we know our multiplication facts, we know that all we have to do is multiply 2 times 5 to get 10, right guys? So 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 5 is 5. So now we have 5/10. So we know that 1/2 is equivalent to 5/10. So if we're comparing 5/10 to 4/10, we know that 5/10 or 5 pieces out of 10 would be bigger, right? So 5/10, this is kind of hard, is greater than 4/10. Or we could even write 1/2 is greater than 4/10, right guys? Because we know 5/10 is really the same thing as the 1/2 that they were asking us about. Okay, let's do a couple more. Okay, so notice I changed this to say 1/2 is greater than 4/10 because we always want to answer the question in the same format that they asked it. So they didn't ask us which was greater, 5/10 or 4/10, right? They asked us 1/2, which we were able to find out was the same as 5/10. Okay, let's go down to the bottom. So it only makes sense that if we can use multiplication to help us compare unlike fractions, we could also use division, right guys? Because we know division is the opposite of multiplication. So let's try one where we divide instead of multiplying and see how we do. So this time they're asking us which is less, 3/12 or 2/4. So this time we want to look at that 12 and we have to figure out what could we divide that 12 by to get the answer 4. If we can't think of that off the top of our head, we could just do it the opposite way, right guys? We could start with the 4 and go, okay, how many times would 4 go into 12? And we could count by 4. 4, 8, 12. So if we know 4 times 3 is 12, then of course 12 divided by 3 is 4. So now we know that we're dividing by 3. So 12 divided by 3 is 4. 3 divided by 3 is 1, right? Because 3 can only go into 3 one time. So that means 3/12 is equivalent to 1/4, which means now we have 1/4 and 2/4 to compare. And we know that 1/4 is less than 2/4 because 1 piece out of 4 would definitely be less than 2 pieces out of 4, right guys? So 3/12, also known as 1/4 because we just figured that out, right? 3/12 is less than 2/4. Okay, let's try one of these down here at the bottom. Okay, number 13 is asking us which is greater, 8/12 or 1/3. So we need to get these fractions to where they are like fractions so that we are able to compare them, right guys? So we need to find our common denominator. When I say common denominator, I just mean I want to get both fractions to where they have the same denominator so that they're easier to compare. So we've got our 8/12 and we've got our 1/3. So we just saw up here that 12 divided by 3 was 4, right, guys? So we definitely know that 12 divided by 4 must be 3. That's a fact family, right? So we know that if we divide our 12 by 4, we'll get 3. That way we can compare this 8/12 to the 1/3 a lot easier. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. 8 divided by 4 is 2, of course. And we know we have to do the same thing, right, to that numerator that we do to the denominator. So we've got to divide them both by 4. So we've got 2, whoa, that's a crazy 2 thirds. So we just figured out that 8/12 is equivalent to 2 thirds. So now they're much easier to compare, right, guys? 2 thirds or 1/3, which one's bigger? Definitely 2 pieces out of 3, or 2 thirds, is greater than 1 piece out of 3, or 1/3. So 2 thirds is greater than 1/3. Okay, let's just erase that. Okay, and I think that's going to be it for today, because it looks like tomorrow we're going to be comparing some more unlike fractions. So for today, we're going to stop right here, and we will come back to this tomorrow. See you soon.